Om Sahana Vavatu Sahanao Bhunaktu Sahaviryam Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om Nama Om Vishnu Padhaya Krishna Prishtaya Bhutale Srimate Bhakti Vedanta Swamin Niti Namini Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharane Nirvishesha Shunyavati Paschatya Deshatharine Vanjakalpatarubhyascha Kripasundubhyayeva Cha Patidanam Bhavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Srivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. So this week we are reading chapter 15 of the Bhagavad Gita, titled Purushottama Yoga, or the Yoga of the Supreme Person. All right, text number 1. The Supreme Personality of Godhead said, "It is said that there is an imperishable banyan tree that has its roots upward and its branches down, and whose leaves are the Vedic hymns. One who knows this tree is the knower of the Vedas." Let's go on to the next verse, and it will pull apart exactly what Krishna is talking about regarding this tree. The branches of this tree extend downward and upward, nourished by the three modes of material nature. The twigs are the objects of the senses. This tree also has roots going down, and these are bound to the fruitive actions of human society. Let's back up, because otherwise we'll get too far ahead and we'll lose the visual Krishna is trying to create here. So he's saying there's this imperishable banyan tree, roots upwards, branches down. The leaves of this tree are the Vedic hymns. One who knows this tree is a knower of the Vedas. This tree Krishna is talking about, this tree represents this material world, material creation, not just this planet, all of material creation. And he describes it as an upside down tree. The roots are up and the branches are down. There's really no such thing as an upside down tree. The only way you can, or we can possibly understand the idea of an upside down tree, is if you go to the bank of a river and you look at the reflection of a tree across the river in the water. It looks like the branches are down and the roots are going upwards. So in other words, there's a perverted reflection that exists on the bank, on the water, the surface of the water, that reflection. That's the only place where this tree, this type of visual of a tree exists. This is the tree that Krishna is describing. That this material world is actually a reflection of a real tree. There is a real tree, but its reflection on the water is the tree that we are perceiving, that we perceive. Now remember, this does not mean a reflection isn't real. We can perceive a reflection, but a reflection itself is not real. This doesn't mean the world isn't real. This world is real. A lot of philosophical schools of thought would like to say the world isn't real. That's not what Krishna is saying. Krishna, the world is real, but it is our perception and identification with it that has to change. And this is when we look at, in this example, the water. The water is our desires. So we have the reality of the tree, the real tree. When it is reflected upon our desires, then this other reflected tree comes into being, if you will. So this perception, this material world, this material creation exists because of our contaminated, conditioned desire. If we purify the desire, then that reflection no longer exists, right? Because reflection exists on the water. The water is our conditioned desire. We purify that, the reflection goes away, and the only thing we have interaction with is the actual tree itself. So now Krishna is describing this reflected tree on the water. And that's when Krishna says, the branches of this tree extend downward and upward, nourished by the three modes of material nature. Our desires, what we want to experience in life, chasing after pleasure, running away from displeasure, these are all based on our interaction with the modes of material nature in relation to our desires, right? The twigs are the objects of the senses, right? The senses are trying to engage with their objects. This tree also has roots going down, and these are bound to the fruitive actions of human nature. In other words, this tree is rooted, so to speak, this reflected tree is rooted in our activities. We're trying to chase after the objects of the senses. We're trying to please these senses because we have a conditioned mentality. Our desires are conditioned. So we have this condition and this idea that our happiness exists in the gratifying of our senses. So we engage in all kinds of activities. And it's these activities that keep us bound in samsara, this cycle of birth and death. Now let's go on to text 3 and 4. The real form of this tree cannot be perceived in this world, right? So there's a reflection. The real form is actually on the bank. But we are, because of our conditioned desire, we are focused on the reflection. As long as we are wrapped up in our conditioned desires, trying to satisfy or believing that only through the satisfaction of the senses can we experience that happiness, as long as that's our erroneous belief, we cannot look up and see the actual tree. We're merely engaged in focusing on this reflection. The real form of this tree cannot be perceived in this world. No one can understand where it ends, where it begins, or where its foundation is. But with determination, one must cut down this strongly rooted tree with the weapon of detachment. Therefore, one must seek that place from which, having gone, one never returns, and there surrender to that supreme personality of Godhead, from whom everything began, and from whom everything has extended since time immemorial. Let's back up a little bit. There's a lot going on here. So this tree, even the reflection of this tree, the real tree we have no concept of, or we cannot perceive it because of our conditioned desires in mind. But even the reflection, it's a reflection of the real tree. So also we don't understand the actual extent of the reflection of this tree. But even so, Krishna says the way we deal with this, right, because the reflection is happening on our desires, that's where the reflection exists. That's where we perceive it. The way we deal with this reflection is through the weapon of detachment. Let's talk a little bit about attachment and detachment. To define attachment, an attachment is the erroneous belief that my fulfillment comes with the gratification of my senses, my material senses. If I eat a pizza, I will be fulfilled. That's an attachment. This belief, the belief, not the actual act, the belief that my fulfillment, that's attachment. The belief that I will be fulfilled if I can connect my senses in a pleasurable manner with the sense objects. That belief is an attachment. Now, this doesn't mean that we do not experience some measure of pleasure, right? You have some pizza, you eat it, there's some pleasure. This doesn't mean that if you're hungry and you have something to eat, you won't have satiation of the body. Absolutely. We're not talking about pleasure of the senses. We're not talking about fulfilling one's hunger. That is going to happen. Absolutely. We're talking about fulfillment. Fulfillment is beyond mere satisfaction of the senses. Studies, scientists have long since explored and come to the same conclusion. Fulfillment of being is beyond the gratification of the senses. That is where detachment begins. The understanding, right? Attachment is an erroneous belief that our fulfillment comes from the satisfaction of the senses. Detachment is the recognition, the clarity of mind that my fulfillment does not come from the satisfaction of the senses. I can have pizzas all I want, that's fine, but my fulfillment doesn't come from there. Because, and this is very key, I am not my senses. If we were our senses, then connecting our senses with the sense objects, that's fulfillment. But we are not our senses. We are not our physical body. So fulfilling the needs of the physical body does not fulfill the needs of who we are as individual spiritual beings. So that realization is detachment. We often think detachment and attachment has to whether or not to do going to the forest in the Himalayas and standing on our head and having only one pair of underwear, like the Babajis of Kailash and Rishikesh. That's not attachment, detachment. That's the same idea Arjuna thought. That's the same, rather, misconception Arjuna had. Krishna, are you telling me to go to the forest and stand on my head and have only one pair of underwear? Is that what it means to be detached? Krishna says, no, that's not renunciation. That is, I'm talking about, Krishna saying, manasa vairagya. It's within the mind, detachment with it's your concept, your understanding. So if an attachment is the misconception that if I fulfill my senses, I will achieve fulfillment, then detachment is a clarification of that misconception, coming to the true understanding that no, because I am not my senses, no matter how much I try to satisfy my senses, I, the Jivatma, will not experience fulfillment. That realization is detachment. Eat all the pizza you want. Simply know that it is not going to lead to your ultimate fulfillment because your senses, your stomach, your eyes, your ears are not you. Who are you? What does it take to fulfill you? Having found out, having gained self-realization, knowing who you are, what satisfies and fulfills you. Not the tongue, not the eyes, not the ears, not the nose, not the belly, not the body. You. Therefore, one must seek that place from which, having gone, one never returns, and there surrender to that Supreme Personality of Godhead, from whom everything began and from whom everything has extended since time immemorial. Text 5. Those who are free from false prestige, illusion, false association, who understand the eternal, and who are done with material lust, who are freed from the dualities of happiness and distress, and who, unbewildered, know how to surrender unto the Supreme Person, attain to that eternal kingdom. In other words, the reflection of the water dissipates because we have purified our consciousness, and we see and can relate to the tree that is the eternal spiritual kingdom. But there must be free. Krishna says false prestige, illusion, false association, because these things all clutter our perception. But if we understand the eternal, who we are, the senses are not eternal. The tongue, the body is not eternal. If we understand the eternal, that's detachment. If we focus on satisfying the eternal, that's detachment. And then from that detachment, that reflection dissipates, and we can now deal with the reality of the tree, the spiritual kingdom of who the Supreme and who we are in relationship. Text 6. That supreme abode of mine is not illumined by the sun or moon, nor by fire or electricity. Those who reach it never return to this material world. This is having gained that clarity. There is always choice. There is, because love, bhakti, cannot exist without choice. There is always choice. But having experienced the reflection and having experienced reality, the choices you make will speak for themselves. Text 7. The living entities in this conditioned world are my eternal fragmental parts, jiva, bhuta, sanatana. Eternally, jiva, bhuta. Due to conditioned life, this conditioned idea, they are struggling very hard with the 6 senses, which include the mind. Remember, attachment is just an idea. It's just the mind. This reflection is just resting on the surface of this river of conditioned desires and our identification with the senses. Text 8. The living entity in the material world carries his different conceptions of life from one body to another, as the air carries aromas. Thus, he takes one kind of body and again quits it to take another, because the body is not eternal. So stuffing the body, fulfilling the senses, dealing with the senses of each body we happen to inhabit is not going to lead to fulfillment, because we are not those material bodies. So who we are, the jivatma, literally doesn't die, becomes malnourished spiritually, because we're feeding these various bodies in this cycle of samsara, because we are identifying with those bodies, not having self-realization that we are jivatma. Text 9. Thus the living entity, thus, taking another gross body, obtains a certain type of ear, eye, tongue, nose, sense of touch, which are grouped about the mind. He or she thus enjoys a particular set of sense objects. So we have all these senses grouped about the mind. We have this misconception. We identify with them, and the story writes itself. Text 10. The foolish cannot understand how a living entity can quit his body, nor can they understand what sort of body he enjoys under the spell of the modes of material nature. But one whose eyes are trained in knowledge can see all this. So when we are completely fixated on this identification that we are our senses and our body, we don't want to give up the body. We want to, in fact, we dream of being resurrected within this very same body. Leaving this body and taking on a new body, we don't want to leave this body. Our attachment, our identification is so wrapped up in this body that even after death, we want to have it resurrected so we can live in this body once again. Krishna is saying, one whose eyes are trained in actual knowledge will see that the body is just. That's why Krishna taught, it was Krishna's very first teaching in the Bhagavad Gita, Vasamsi Jiranani Yatabhihaya. This body is nothing but clothing. It's nothing but clothing. If you see it as anything more than just clothing, you're going to be disappointed. Text 11. The endeavoring transcendentalists who are situated in self-realization can see all this clearly, right? Self-realization, that's all it takes. That's not easy, but that's what the issue is, self-realization. We are not the eyes, we're not the ear, we're not the tongue, we're not the mind. These are all grouped about the mind, and it has a conditioning, and then our ego gets involved and we have this identity. That's not the case. We are Jivatma, Jiva, Bhuta, Sanatana, right? The living entities, text 7, the living entities in this world are my eternal fragmental parts, that we are part of the Supreme. That's our identity. We work on nourishing, feeding that identity, then there is fulfillment. That's what detachment is. That's what detachment is. Recognizing we are Jiva Bhuta Sanatana, working from that reality, then we are nourishing and fulfilling who we are. Let's carry on. The endeavoring transcendentalists who are situated in self-realization can see all this clearly. But those whose minds are not developed and who are not situated in self-realization cannot see what is taking place, though they may try. Self-realization. That is self-realization. Without self-realization, there's nowhere to go, because we're identifying with the wrong reality. We're identifying with the fact, the idea that we are our body, and our body is nothing more than a set of clothing. Text 12. A set of clothing, or let's use a different example, a vehicle which we need to get us somewhere. Our body is a vehicle. Well, it must be taken care of. It must be properly maintained. Absolutely. But it is a vehicle to get us to self-realization. And it certainly should not get in the way of our self-realization. Text 12. The splendor of the sun, which dissipates the darkness of this whole world, comes from me. And the splendor of the moon and the splendor of fire are also from me. So Krishna is saying, right? He said, Jiva Bhuta Sanatana. All living entities are part of me. They're just like me. And let me tell you a little bit about me so you can understand a little bit about yourself. Text 13. I enter into each planet, and by my energy, they stay in orbit. I become the moon and thereby supply the juice of life to all vegetables. Text 14. I am the fire of digestion in the bodies of all living entities, and I join with the air of life, outgoing and incoming, to digest the four foodstuffs, the four kinds of foodstuffs. Text 15. I am seated in everyone's heart, and from me come remembrance, knowledge, and forgetfulness. By all the Vedas, I am to be known. Indeed, I am the compiler of Vedanta, and I am the knower of the Vedas. Text 16. There are two classes of beings, the fallible and the infallible. In the material world, every living entity is fallible, and in the spiritual world, every living entity is called infallible. Kshara and akshara, right? Fallible and infallible. Fallible, Krishna is referring to those who are conditioned, who are dealing with this reflection. They're fallible. They're dealing with the senses, the mind. They're just making all kinds of miscalculations and just wrapped up in samsara. Infallible are those who are dealing with the tree. Those who have self-realization understand that they are spirit beings, Jiva Bhuta, Sanatana, qualitatively one with the Supreme, and they're dealing with the tree. They're infallible. They are not subject to the, how would you say, the conditioning of, they're not bamboozled by the conditioning of the ahankar. They are dealing with, they're eating just as much pizza as the rest of us, but they're not under the misconception that they are eating that the eating of pizza is nourishing their spiritual being. In fact, they spend their time nourishing their spiritual being, and pizza is secondary. Eat pizza when the pizza arrives. It's as simple as that. Text 17. Is it 17 or 16? 17. Besides these two, there is the greatest living personality, the Supreme Soul, the imperishable Lord himself, who has entered into the three worlds and is maintaining them. Text 18. Because I am transcendental, beyond both the fallible and the infallible, and because I am the greatest, I am celebrated both in the world and in the Vedas as that supreme person. So Krishna is beyond both the fallible and the infallible, right? The fallible is the one who's dealing with their material conditioning and are dealing with the reflection of the tree. The infallible is someone who's self-realized and is dealing with the tree. Krishna is beyond both. He recognized simultaneously both the reflection and the tree. Not at all bamboozled by the reflection, knows it's a reflection, and knows the tree, knows both. So Krishna is beyond both the fallible and the infallible. Text 19. Whoever knows me as the Supreme Personality of Godhead without doubting is the knower of everything. He therefore engages himself or herself in full devotional service to me, O son of Bharata. Text 20. This is the most confidential part of the Vedic scriptures. I'll say that again. This is the most confidential part of the Vedic scriptures, O sinless one, and it is disclosed now by me. Whoever understands this will become wise, and his endeavors, her endeavors, will know perfection. In other words, what's confidential is that we are not this body. Don't be attached to it. Not only that, you are Jiva Bhuta Sanatana. You are eternally a spiritual being. And included with this the actual most confidential part is that if you know me, that's all you need to know. Because I am beyond the fallible and the infallible. So by knowing me, you know everything. You know everything about yourself. All there is to be known. You know absolutely everything. That's the most confidential part of the Vedic literatures. You know everything without having to, and knowing everything does not mean you know the lottery number. Knowing everything simply means you know that if you flick the light switch, the light will come on. Some people want to know the diagram, the wiring of the entire building, right? They get lost in understanding how the bulb works. And while they're so caught up in the understanding of how the bulb works, they're sitting in darkness, not knowing that all you need is a light switch. Know that the light functions by switching on the light switch, and everything is illuminated. But if you don't know about the light switch, it doesn't matter how much you know about a light bulb. If you do not know that it is a light switch that activates the light bulb, then your knowledge of the light bulb is essentially useless. It's like giving the light bulb to an individual who's never seen a light bulb before. They may be able to pull it apart, put it back together like a puzzle. But if they don't know, it has to be connected to an electricity source for which there's a light switch that activates it. What's the use of that knowledge? So that's why Krishna says the most you can know all the Vedas that you want. And Krishna goes over this in the second chapter, as early as the second chapter. What Krishna says, Traigunya Vishaya Veda, Nistraigunya Bhavarjuna, Nirdvandva Nityasatpasto Niryogakshema Atmavan. The Vedas deal mainly with the three modes of material nature. Traigunya Vishaya Veda, Nistraigunya Bhavarjuna. The Vedas deal with the three modes of material nature. Pulling apart the light bulb. That's perfectly fine if you need to know, how the light bulb works. But then Krishna says become transcendental to these three modes. In the very next verse, Krishna says, Yavanartha dhapane sarvata samputo tavan sarveshu vedeshu brahmanasya vijanata. All the purposes served by a small well can at once be served by a great reservoir of water. Similarly, all the purposes of the Vedas can be served to one who knows the purpose behind them. That's the light switch. If you know all about the light bulb, but don't know that you need a light switch to activate it, what's the use? So this is the most confidential part of the Vedas. The most confidential part of the Vedas is the light switch. Om Tat Saditi Srimad Bhagavad Gita Upanishatsu Brahma Vidyaya Yoga Shastre Shri Krishna Jana Sambhade Purushottama Yoga Nama Panchadhasham Adhyaya Om Sahana Vavatu Sahana Bhunaktu Sahaviryam Kuruvavahai Tejasvina Vadhitamastu Ma Vidvishavahai Om Shanti 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 Om Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Srivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. See you next week for chapter 16. Hari Hari.